to be a fun topic and hopefully an interesting topic for you. So we're going to dive right in. Of course, you have the workshop slides. There is a little kind of quiz exercise afterwards. There's a lot of different resources. So there's that resources link. If you go there, you'll be able to see everything. There I am trying to look professional, and I think I just look glum. So sorry about that, but that's me in a library with my computer. After we're done with this, you should be able to understand what BIBFRAME is and why it's important. But then we're also going to talk about sort of like the future, like how this is the intersection between where we are now and where we're going with the future in terms of our data. And then we're going to talk about tools to practice with BIBFRAME, and we're actually going to go through the process of creating a record in BIBFRAME so you can see what that looks like. So there's been a lot of development in the BIBFRAME environment in the last 6 months to a year. So I'm going to share some projects. I'm going to show you some tools that you can use, and then I'm going to talk about sort of how you can play with this and start exploring it a little bit more. So BIBFRAME comes from Bibliographic Framework. It is a new framework for cataloging, and that's creating that descriptive metadata that we all do, and it's built on modern data practices, and this is a big part of it. Looks like it will be the MARC replacement one day. Now, when they started first experimenting and thinking about like what are we going to look like getting out of MARC, what are records going to look like, how is this going to work, there was a lot of discussion about, is BIBFRAME, this is sort of an experimental thing, and maybe it will be, maybe it won't be. It's looking more and more like this is going to be it. And part of the reason why it's looking more and more like this is going to be it is because there's some really big projects out there where they are building entire catalogs in BIBFRAME, or they're simultaneously cataloging. So for those of you who are catalogers and you're like, wow, I got so much work to do, just think about how much work you'd have to do if you had to create a MARC record and a BIBFRAME record for everything you're creating, everything you're cataloging. So there are libraries where catalogers are doing that. We're going to talk a little bit about some of those projects. There's a nice list of what they call implementations. You can go visit those projects. There's lots of examples, and I would suggest doing that, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So this really is looking like it is going to be a very likely replacement for MARC one day. Now, although we're going to look a little bit at code, I want to reinforce that I do not believe that catalogers are going to be coding. And you may be coding if you're doing some kind of system work, or you may interact with the code if you're doing some kind of systems work, or maybe if you're working with ebooks, or you're an institutional repository or a digital library, maybe you're working with code some, but as a whole, I think we're going to be working with code less. So yay for those of you who don't like to code or look at the MARC record. So I think we're going to be seeing less of the code stuff, but we are going to look at the code stuff a little bit because we're going to look at it in comparison to MARC records. So, what is this in terms of RDA? How does this work with RDA? Well, RDA stands for Resource Description and Access, and this is our set of guidelines, or rules as we kind of like to think of them sometimes. This is our set of guidelines or rules for creating the metadata. So this is the instructions for how we describe a resource. There's that description aspect of it, and how we facilitate its access. So that is essentially, RDA tells you what information you're going to actually put into that record. How are you going to record the title? How are you going to record how many pages it is, or how many, how big the CD is, or whatever it may be. RDA actually tells you how to go about doing that. RDA is also meant to be, and this is really a big shift with RDA, it's meant to be agnostic, or not part of any particular format. So you can actually format RDA. You can use RDA cataloging and follow the RDA principles in a digital library software. Or you can use RDA, you could really use RDA if you wanted to catalog your blogs or your family archives or anything. So you can use those guidelines for how you describe those materials really in any kind of software out there you wanted to use. It doesn't have to be MARC. And so that was actually one of the sort of key features of RDA, is they wanted to revise our guidelines so they weren't tied to MARC as much. And then some other things, we need to look at digital content, all that kind of stuff. BIBFRAME then is actually about the structure of the record. So much as we use MARC to structure our record, when you're cataloging, you are looking at records, you're looking at the MARC record, but then you're also looking at that content within it. That content within it is guided by RDA. The structure of the record is guided by your system that you're using, but also that MARC formatting. So BIBFRAME is about the structure of the record. RDA, we're just going to look at it in brief to kind of set the stage as we go forward here. RDA is based upon 3 modeling frameworks. Bibliographic part of it, so that's your sort of descriptive part of it about your resource itself. This would have been FRBR, so functional requirements. And if you kind of think about what some of these words mean, just like when we were looking at RDA, it'll help you kind of see how they fit into things. So RDA is about that resource and how are you going to describe it and how are you going to provide access to it. So those, then FRBR, your functional requirements. So what are the requirements for our records to work? What are those functional requirements? And specifically, the part of it that's the most important of that FRBR model, if you've studied that, is what's called that WMI hierarchy, and that's a hierarchy of our data. Work, expression, manifestation, item. We're not going to go too much into that. We're just kind of setting the stage and kind of hitting on our foundations in RDA. Authorities, so that would be our subject headings. Well, subject headings are in subjects. Subject headings are kind of an authority, but subjects are kind of broken up by themselves. Authorities, that would be our names, so all the names of the people that we have in our records. Now we call them agents, so that's kind of a change in the last, maybe the last 2.5 years, we've moved to calling authorities agents. You'll still see a whole lot of people call them authorities, including me, but the official category for that in our framework is agents. And this was actually at one point called the functional requirements of authority data. So just like we have functional requirements, what are the requirements for our bibliographic records? What are the requirements for our bibliographic data? We had a companion piece of what are our requirements for our authority data. That would be those authorized forms of the names. That would be like a 100 field in a MARC record, or a 700 field in a MARC record, or a 600 field in a MARC record. So places where we put people's names, or names of institutions, or names of conferences, things like that. And then we had subjects, and subjects now have really gotten shaken up in the last few years into dividing them into nomen. Nomen, it just means a name, so that's anything. Anything can be a subject. If you write a book about me, I'm the subject of that book. If you write a book that's about dogs, dogs are going to be the subject of that book. So anything can fall into that name category of a subject. And then place, because geographic place, and then we've actually added a new one in subjects now called time space, and this really has to do with time and events, which in traditional cataloging we've not had as much. This was formerly called FRESAD. Again, functional requirements. How do we want our subjects, authority data, how do we want that data to function? What you need to know from all of that was a very quick overview of it, but what you really need to know about that is that we have combined those 3 frameworks into one, and it's called the Library Reference Model, LRM. And that was as of 2017-ish was when it first started. We really have started to see this in the last couple of years show up, last year really. So if you're looking at the RDA Toolkit, which is a website, that is now the official source of the RDA instructions. So that's how you find out, how to catalog something. Now, if you are copy cataloging, or you're receiving records, or you're doing something else, you may have your own procedures in-house, or you may share procedures across your system or consortia, whatever. but those procedures are based upon RDA somewhere. So not everybody has access to the RDA toolkit. You do have to pay for it, unfortunately, but it is a website, and that's where you get your official source. That is a big change for what we've done before with cataloging, because with cataloging we actually at one point had those print manuals, and at one point it's a giant print manual, and then you just updated it kind of interfiled when you needed to make updates. They don't do that anymore. It's a website. You have to buy access to it. So the reason why I even mentioned the LRM is because that is a change, and they started working on it in 2017, but it's being rolled into what they call the R3, or the new version of the RDA toolkit. So if you go look at the RDA toolkit, you will start seeing some of these words and terms I've just mentioned. RDA's goal is also to facilitate the metadata creation for not only bibliographic things, the things we have in libraries, but also cultural heritage resources. So as I mentioned earlier, it can be used really to catalog anything you might want to catalog. So if you are working on a special archives or a digital library project, institutional repository project, you could use RDA. If you know people who are working on those projects, then that may be an opportunity to kind of partner up and figure out, what are the best practices going to be. And the other part of RDA is really focused on not only those modern data practices, so again, looking at how the community as a whole, how does the web community do things, how should we be modeling our data. So, we've been around for a long time before the internet. Libraries existed before the internet. MARC existed before the internet. It's amazing to think that MARC was created in 1968. I mean, it's been around for a long time, so we should be very proud of it, but at the same time, it's nowhere like anything out on the web, right? It's not going to be a modern data practice at all because, well, it was created in 1968 before such things really existed. So, RDA was also looking at not only getting us out of MARC, how can we expand our community, how can we fold in things like museums and other cultural heritage resources, but how can we have cataloging rules or guidelines that will follow modern data practices. And so really looking at how we build relationships between data, and that would include using linked data, and then also focusing on what our users need. So it really, one of the things we did with RDA in these three frameworks is that we stepped all the way outside of our work. And I can't imagine the committees that worked on this, because we are so focused on the thing that comes across our desk and making sure that people can find what they need in our library. But those are our user tasks right there. But making sure the record matches, getting it received, getting it cataloged, all that stuff. We're so focused on sort of the almost like an accountant, putting in the invoices and checking the numbers and all that stuff. We're so focused on the mechanics and the technique of our work so much that I think that it was a big thing to take a moment and completely step back and look at the theoretical and the philosophy of what we do. And so, that was one of the things with RDA, is that there was this big step back to kind of look at from a more critical, analytical overview, what is the purpose of cataloging, why are we doing it, and how can we align as a community of metadata practitioners, how can we align ourselves with all of these other people out here who are doing work that's similar to us. So that in itself is a big step back to kind of look at what we're doing, to kind of take away the attention from sort of the daily work a little bit and actually look at, why do we do what we do? Is what we do, is it successful? Does it work with things like digitizing and being able to harvest metadata? And so when you look at the RDA guidelines, if you start thinking about harvesting metadata, artificial intelligence, how that may work with our data, you'll start seeing some of those aspects built in. For example, title. Title is now a transcribed field. What does that mean? It means that you record it as it appears on your item or whatever you may have in front of you. Well, if you are using AI or you're using some kind of software that's going to harvest, that's going to create that title from the resource itself, having that field be transcription is much, that is easier because the machine can do that, right? It can look at a title on a title page and it can pull out that information if it's digitized, and it can create that title. So some of the things when you look in RDA are driven by the opportunities we may have or things we may already be doing, like in digital archives, special collections, institutional repositories, even on our websites, where we want to be able to work with that kind of data, but we need to have guidelines that will allow us to do things like the field's going to be transcription. So BIBFRAME will likely be our replacement for MARC. And I've already talked about MARC a little bit, but MARC stands for Machine Readable Cataloging. 1968. I've already talked about all of this, but this was before cell phones, the internet, social media. Gosh, just, for everything, right? Just about. So yes, we did a fantastic thing, right? I mean, I really think we should give MARC more credit. I know it gets it gets down talked so much because it really hasn't been able to keep up with sort of where we are now in terms of the larger web, and that's understandable because it was created in 1968. I think as a piece of technology, it is an amazing achievement that is still in use after all of this time. There have been some updates and some revisions, but the issue with MARC is really about the structure itself. So that's really sort of the sticking point for us. MARC did facilitate the transfer of print card catalogs to a digital format. So that's really the beginning of all of it, is taking a print card and turning it into an electronic record. And so that also guided that process of trying to take what was on a card and just convert it to an electronic record. That sort of has been a driving force in terms of what we do with cataloging for all these years. So much of what we did before RDA was just mimicking that process. How do we convert that print card into that electronic format? And then once we got completely to electronic, we're just creating electronic records, we still had things that were hanging over from that print card process. So, we have really come a long way in terms of what we do. But, there's all these people out here that are doing so much more than we're able to do because we are limited by MARC. We are all content creators. We create data. If you think you're not a content creator because you don't have a blog, if you do Facebook, if you do Instagram, if you do email, if you send text messages, if you take photos, if you do video, every time you do any of that, you are creating data. So, if you're tagging people, you're creating data. If you are answering people in an email, there's some data associated with that. And there have been these communities of practice that have been developed to describe and organize web resources, or sometimes use artificial intelligence, as I was talking about with harvesting and creating those titles. But this community practice has gone so much further beyond what we can do because we're limited by MARC. And it is an evolving landscape. So we have the sort of the traditional web, which they called a web of documents. Sometimes people called it Web 1.0. We had the social web, where people started being able to interact with the web and do stuff. That was sort of Web 2.0. You might have heard that talk about. And now we have the semantic web, which is the human and machine working together to create resources and to be able to share them across various platforms. And this is also getting to that sort of sense of the Internet of Things. So you may wonder, like, well, what happened to the semantic web? Or what happened at one point? Didn't they call it Web 3.0? Or what's the Internet of Things? They're kind of all the same thing. So the semantic web just describes an interconnected virtual world of data. So that's, these are the important pieces that's driving why we're getting to BIBFRAME, how we're getting to BIBFRAME. It's interconnected data. It's all that data out there. It's driven by a variety of devices and platforms, and it's a very diverse ecosystem of data. So you have data coming from Facebook, you have data coming from Zoom, you have data coming from your email, you have data coming from your cell phone, you have data coming from the ebook you're reading, you have data from your library catalog, you have data from YouTube, data everywhere. So all these different data platforms, devices. You have an iPhone, my mom has a Kindle, I have an Android, my niece has a Samsung Galaxy. You know, we all have these different things, and each one is a different platform. So the semantic web, which is sort of where we are right now, we just didn't have a party for it. So we kind of have arrived at the semantic web, but we just never celebrated it or had a party, which too bad for the semantic web, right? But data is interpreted, it's remixed, it's repurposed, the machines are doing their things. I mean, we all know that, right? You know, it's like you look and you're shopping on an online shopping thing and up comes some recommendations for you, or maybe you're looking for books and up comes some recommendations for you. Those recommendations are built by the computer. You know, there's not somebody actually sitting there typing you up some recommendations typically. And this is building new connections through linking to data rather than copying it. So it's looking at patterns. This is where you get to sort of that concept of big data, where you're looking at all these different patterns and the machine is looking at patterns, trying to make sense of it, and then linking to that data rather than copying it. The most important part of it for us to kind of think about, though, is that data is structured with a strong focus on relationships, especially via linked data. So as we're going forward, these are the things we need to be thinking about for how our data is going to be modeled. You know, how are we going to take a MARC record, which is very flat, kind of top to bottom? It does not do this linking data thing well at all. It is structured, but there's no real focus on relationships. There's a couple of places in the MARC record where there's some relationships aspect. We've added more through RDA. But still, we're very limited in terms of that structure. We can now add some linked data in records, in MARC records, but again, the structure of it is not really compatible with this larger web world. So, you know, this is our world, right? We are just like everywhere, and we're using every device, and especially now more than ever, right? We're just doing everything on all these different devices. Connected, sharing, personalized, device agnostic. It's not dependent upon any particular device. You can shop on your refrigerator now, right? Or some people can. My refrigerator doesn't do that, but some people can. This is our Internet of Things. So when you hear the Internet of Things, it's just about all of this data. That's the, you know, for us looking at it through our metadata cataloger system lens, library lens, we're looking at it and thinking about the data part of it, right? If you're using the Internet of Things, you're just like, wow, it's so cool, I can shop on my refrigerator, or I can shop on my phone and send my grocery list to my refrigerator, or, you know, whatever you may be doing. I can send, you know, I can watch movies on my PlayStation, or I can stream through Amazon, or whatever it may be. So BIBFRAME is developed with an eye towards the future and this larger web community. It's about making our data more interoperable, that it will work with all these things that are out there, more transferable, that it can be portable, that it can move between systems better, extensible, we can scale it up. So this is going to look like and work more like what's out there in the larger web community, and more modular. So we're going to break up our data structure more. Now, in terms of extensible, you may think, well, why don't we just use what's out there on the web already? Well, think about websites. Think about when you're searching on Google. We put a lot more information into our records, right? We use controlled vocabularies. We use the Library of Congress subject headings. We use genre terms that are from a controlled vocabulary. We put call numbers into our records, especially for print items. We used authorized access points and point directly to an authority record for our names. We have specific rules or guidelines, as RDA would tell us, for how we put information into our records. And it's much more robust beyond what's out there on the larger web community. If you search my name or anybody's name, unless your name is super unusual, pick a name, search a John Smith in Google, go look, or Jane Smith in Google, go look and see what you find. How many different versions of that person do you find? All those different resources out there for all those different Jane Smiths. There is no true authority control as we do, or even a way to kind of pull all those resources together and pull them together according to the person. There are some projects, starting to be some projects. If you search me, you will see my little Google profile kind of thing that comes up. But there are some projects out there that are starting to do it. But it's still kind of all mixed up, right? If you go to a library catalog and you search for a particular person, it's pretty easy to see those resources pulled together. So we have a real level of expertise in terms of being able to organize our resources, describe our resources, and to be able to pull those resources together according to topic, according to author, and according to names. So we have much more in terms of our data than sort of what the larger web community does. There are some projects out there, and there have been some projects out there to try to sort of enhance the web community metadata as a whole, but it just doesn't really seem to take off. So I like this little slide because one of the things that I think is we're thinking about, especially as we look at BIBFRAME, is how we fit into this larger landscape. Like, where do we fit into this? And I just like this little thing because we have all this stuff over here with the public benefits, and if you have research, like how does that work? And for the faculty member, how does that work? They get career recognition, they get citations, they might get new partnerships, all that kind of stuff. But then if you look over here under the research category, it's easier to find useful resources, resources archived and preserved for the future. This is us. This is our little area over here. So we do fit into this larger landscape if we can unlock our MARC records. If we can get out of MARC records in a way that they can be used easier for all these different systems. If you've ever tried to Google a MARC record and actually look at a MARC record in Google, you don't get a really nice display if you're actually just trying to see the code kind of thing. So, being able to unlock our records to where we can use them and be part of this larger system. And this is just one little example of, a scientist or a faculty researcher and how we may be part of that larger environment. If you think about all the different kinds of authors that we have, you could replace the scientist with a literary author, and it would be the same sort of thing. Resources archived and preserved for the future, being able to participate as part of this community, easier for our users to find things. For the literary author, more recognition, selling more books, more partnerships, more fan fiction maybe. Who knows? But there's all kinds of opportunities in that. So, I also liked this too because it kind of looks at our data elements and kind of talks about that process in terms of the more that you break up as you go further down, the more that you break up your data elements, the more reusable they can be. And it also is the more context you can then provide. So that is the other piece of this. So we have one more thing to talk about for the semantic web, just because if you're out there and you start looking at semantic web stuff, you're going to run into this term. And this term feels a little bit weird, and if you go out in the semantic web and you start looking around, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, what does this mean? Well, I've given you my adorable puppy to kind of help you. So this is very much a data aspect part of this. And it has to do with the relationships and data. And these are called triples or triplets, depending on which resource you're looking at. The simplest definition is that it's a relationship between the subject, the verb, and the object. If you learn this, back in like elementary school, that's the idea of it. You know, my dog's name is Kukini. My dog is Kukini. Thomas Jefferson was the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, that sort of thing. So triples, when you go out in the semantic, if you start reading around semantic web stuff, you start reading around BIBFRAME stuff, you're going to start running into this term. Triples is a defined relationship between the data. That's all it is. For us in cataloging, what do we call it? We just call it relationships, right? So don't let that term kind of catch you up, because when you're going out in these communities or you start reading more BIBFRAME stuff and you start reading like expressed in triples or expressed in triplets, that just means the relationship. They're talking about the relationship of it. So one of the things that's different in this data practice is that they're actually defining that part of the relationship, and each one of those is the data element. So the subject's the data element, the verb's the data element, the object's the data element. Now, when we are cataloging, we don't really have a way in a traditional MARC catalog record to define this. I mean, we know it to be true, right? If we have a record for the Declaration of Independence, we know that if it was a book about Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, being the primary author, we know that he has a role as an author. So, you know, we might have a 100 field, Jefferson Thomas, and his dates, and then we have our 245, you know, writing the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, and we know that relationship is there. We know that the relationships exist between that. The MARC record doesn't make that relationship clear, though, and even when we add relator codes, as we do now sometimes to kind of denote that relationship, we're still having, that's our way to try to tell the system what that relationship is. So unfortunately with the MARC record, although we have sort of implied relationships, we don't really define it in the data. So that is a little bit of a change for us, because it's like we're taking the data that we would already do and kind of amplifying it, and we're defining that actual relationship using that verb. This brings us to modularity. So remember when I was talking about breaking our data into more bits, breaking up our data more? That's what the concept of triples is about. It's about breaking up our data more. So we can do it with identities. So we could have Jefferson Thomas, there's his WorldCat identity. You know, there's his identity in the WorldCat authority file. And it's the same as, so same as or equal to the Wikipedia entry. So you can see there where we could possibly, if we were looking at something in our bibliographic data, we could possibly link to both of those, right? Because we have that notion that they are equal. Stephen Hawking wrote, author of The Universe in a Nutshell. Again, we have that implied relationship. When we look at this, we see author and we know that to be the relationship, right? We know from looking at author, looking at the title and that subfield C where Stephen Hawking is, we know that to be a relationship. But we really haven't told the software that. We haven't told the system that. So what we know to be true, the system doesn't necessarily know. So this is really a big change in terms of thinking about our data. You know, in MARC we have all these subfields. They mean different things in different parts of the record, right? We have indicators that mean different things depending on which field they're in. And a system has a hard time understanding that because it's not consistent between field to field, and it's not even consistently used. And the data is not even sometimes consistently input. That'd be us. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons why it's hard for machines to really understand that data, and layer on top of it that it does not match any modern data programming languages. So that's what you kind of, when we see triples, when you see the word triplets, you're just thinking about relationship. So here's an example of how we're starting to include some relationship information in records. But we just don't do it that much, right? So as you could see here, we have Thomas Jefferson is the same as the Thomas Jefferson in Wikipedia. Stephen Hawking wrote is the author of The Universe in a Nutshell. That's a pretty easy one, right? Author of, we can kind of see that relationship fairly easily. And so that would be fairly easy for us to, in this case, add a relator or relationship designator, subfield E. So that's getting to that relationship, right? But it doesn't actually tell you the relationship between Thomas Jefferson really explicitly and that notes on the state of Virginia. It's just saying that Thomas Jefferson as a whole is the author. Now we're using it to say that he's the author of that. So we're starting to do this, but not a whole lot. So when you think about the semantic web or the Internet of Things or Web 3.0, whatever term works for you, pick one. Doesn't matter to me. If you want to, just semantic web is just kind of cool. So more data modularity, breaking down those data bits more, granularity, provides more opportunities to use the data in different ways, triples, focused on relationships, and then linking to, so we could link from Thomas Jefferson in our authority file. We could also link over to Wikipedia, linking to data instead of reusing it. So linking data is about, instead of like typing in the name of Thomas Jefferson, we could just link to the Thomas Jefferson entry. The benefit of that is when the author record changes. I know Thomas Jefferson's name is not going to change anytime soon. I think it's pretty set. But, should you have an author that is a new author, or when I worked with electronic thesis and dissertations, students would say what their name was when they filled out their thesis or dissertation, and then they would go off and start writing professionally, and then what would happen? They would decide they want to use their middle name or add their birth date, or they would get married or divorced and want to change their name or change their name for some other reason. So, author names do change depending on, how long ago it was, and also how sort of where they are in their publishing career, where they are in their life a lot of times. So linking to data instead of actually typing in that person's name as we currently do, if we just link to it, our systems could use that information. They could follow that link and display. They could continue to display the name as it appears in the authority record, but we would not have to change the links. So linked data is we're not going to get too far into linked data. I just want to kind of give you the basics of it, because you will see it in BIBFRAME records, because this is part of where we're moving to. As I mentioned, you can put linked data into MARC records. That's kind of a new thing. But looking forward, we are really going to be looking at how we can do this to reduce maintenance. And for those of you who don't outsource your authority records, or you do your own authority maintenance, so when the subject heading changes, you run a report and you fix the subject headings in your records, or maybe you don't do anything at all because you just don't have time for that. This is a wonderful thing, because once those links are in the record and you take the name out, which it's going to take a long time, or maybe not a long time, but it's going to take a while before we're to that point of only having a link in the record. But when we get to the point where we only have a link in the record, then you have no maintenance work on that record for those names or those subjects. So this also can make our subjects, especially for our subject headings, it's an extensive process to change a subject heading in the Library of Congress subject headings. Dewey is a little more flexible, but LC is a very extensive, time-intensive project. You have to submit a proposal, you have to submit evidence, a committee reviews it, and then if they do change it, so as the world evolves, terms change. If they do decide to change it and it gets changed in the Library of Congress subject headings, then everyone who has a record that has that subject heading in it must or really needs to change it. So this is a huge amount of maintenance. Back in the old card catalog days, when we've had terms that changed, especially for people, for ethnic groups, as those terms changed, it involved actually pulling cards, using whiteout, and retyping those subject headings on that card. So thankfully I did not have to do that, but I heard from my elders when I worked for the university how many thousands of cards in a large research library that would involve in terms of pulling cards and retyping subjects. In the electronic day, it's with our MARC records, it's not that kind of work, but it does still involve some kind of work. You either run a report, you might use MARC Edit to fix them, but you still have to do the work to some degree or another. When we get to the point where we're only using links for names, that work will change. It will eventually cease to exist. Now, before you worry that you're not going to have any work to do, some of you probably know, well, yeah, I never have time to do authority work anyway, so I'm not worried. It'll be great. My thinking is always, with cataloging technical services work, there's always something to do. And there's usually older material in our libraries, or maybe you buy a lot of ebooks and you just dump them into your catalog. You just buy those vendor records and you don't have time to look at them. We always have time. Once some part of cataloging work is eliminated, that is the opportunity to look at the other parts of cataloging work. So if you have been buying vendor records and you just dump them into your system and you never look at those records, then that might be a time that you could take a look at those records. Maybe you have a bunch of special collections or local archives that community members or your community members or your college would like to have cataloged. Maybe you have some big donations that are on the way, or your library would like to start seeking donations, but you've never had the time to catalog those. That there's always work to be done. So what does it look like between a text string and linked data? So we have a book by Stephen Hawking. We've already looked at one of his books. In MARC, it would be our title 245 per normal, but we would have our authorized entry point. That would be our 100 field. First indicator 1, Hawking, Stephen, with the dates. As linked data, so linking to the data, we could have this, and this is what we could currently have. We can have Hawking Stephen, and then the date, and then we have the subfield 0, and that's linking to his authority file in the Library of Congress authorities. Eventually, as linked data, we could have something more like this, and this would be following maybe double and core, something else, but we would have our tag, and you see it would have a textual tag. So in this case, I'm using creator instead of a 100 field, and then we're going to link just to the name, and that's it. And then we're going to turn off that field. BIBFRAME, by default, by its best practices, allows us to use the text string. That would be Hawking, Stephen, using the authorized form from the authority file. Allows us to use that, or a link. That'd be something down here like, just the link as I've done it, or both, which is currently what we're starting to see in MARC records. So if you're copy cataloging and you see a subfield 0, that means it's from authoritative resource, and you do not need to worry about that record. You don't need to check it. You don't need to check that subfield 0. I would say just accept it and move on. I would also suggest that you not delete those fields, because at some point when we shift, and I do not know when that will be, so do not ask me to crystal ball on that one, but at some point when we shift to being linked data only, you're going to be a step ahead of the game if you have those subfield 0s in, because we could just eliminate that Hawking Stephen. We can't do it yet, but we could eliminate that Hawking Stephen and just have that subfield 0. Now, the reason why I said we can't do that yet, even if your system would allow you to do that, so many of us are working with OCLC records, and OCLC is not prepared to do this yet, but they are working on projects and looking. So the other thing you're going to see when you go out into this community and you start reading is you're going to start seeing the word URI, and URI stands for Uniform Resource Identifier, and that's a whole mouthful. but there are four principles, and this is from Tim Berners-Lee, who's the founder of the internet. So yes, they've been around for that long. We have not thought about our data this way. So, you know, there's this whole web community out there that's been out there making metadata, and they're doing stuff and building the next Facebook and the next TikTok and all that other great stuff they're out there doing. And we've just been over here kind of doing our thing, and we have our own terminology for things, right? So we're starting to look at how our terminology can fit better, or maybe we can adopt some of that terminology that's being used in the larger communities. So for example, we're starting to see instead of personal name, we're starting to see the word agent appear. Agent being a word that's out there commonly in identity management. And if you hear the word identity management, you're just going to think authorities because that's what it is. So Tim Berners-Lee has 4 principles, and we're starting to look at how we apply these currently, but what we're going to do for the future. So these are practice URI principles for sort of best data modeling. Use URIs as names for things. Well, that's a whole lot, but the key to it is names for things. So for us, what are we currently using when we use a name for a thing? That would be our authority, right? We're using our subject heading. We're using our authorized form of our name. So, you know, we already do that, right? We've been doing that for a long time. Not everybody else in the web community has been doing this, but we have. So we just call it authorities or authority work. Then the second one is use HTTP URI so that people can look up those names. Now this one we've not been doing much. We're starting to, this is where we're getting to that link data. For example, you could link to the Virtual Internet Authority file. You could link to the Library of Congress name authority file. That link there, that's the HTTP, as you see there, HTTP, that's it. Use HTTP URIs, there it is right there, so that people can look up those names. Now he said people, but we know that more than people, it will probably be the system. So, you know, this was a little bit while ago, but that would probably be the system, so that people can look up those names. All right, so we got that one right. URL, Uniform Resource Locator, or location. So it just says where it is on the web. When someone looks up a URI, so if they go look up these names, if they go look up the name in the authority file, right, URI as a name, or they go to the link to the authoritative resource, provide some useful information using the standards. I swear I did not make up that. Think about our rules that we have for how we do authority work, right? Standards, we are all about standards. So we have been doing 1 and 3 for years and never thought about we never thought about it in this way, right? So we have been using URIs as names for things, authorities. We've been doing that years and years and years and years, right? When someone looks up one of these, they go look up that authorized form of the name, they go follow, more recently, they follow that URL, provide some useful information. Well, we're putting more useful information in there now, right? But provide some useful information, provide information about that author using the standards. Well, we're all over that one, right? That's us right there. And then finally, this is the 2 and 4 are the ones that are more recent for us. 2, linking to those resources, which we're starting to do. And then 4, include links to other URIs so that they can discover more things. So this would be about relationships to things outside our particular resource. This is actually getting to what's called RWOs, or real world objects, and we're not going to really talk about it today, but it's a really exciting kind of thing. So if you're interested, let Vicki know and we can talk about it. So link data can be used in MARC records. We've already talked about this, or in BIBFRAME, but instead of typing the name, we can use a URI, which then displays it as the current format. So I just wanted to kind of show you all what it might look like if we were actually using linked data in our records. We could even still have something that looks like a MARC record and we just put the URLs behind it. This is an old little graphic, but I just love love how it's broken down. So when this is from BIBFRAME, so this is directly pulling from BIBFRAME's sort of best practices. When referencing a resource, so when you are going to, well, reference a resource, provide the URI, the label, or both. That's straight from BIBFRAME. So this is a BIBFRAME record. This is the code view of a BIBFRAME record. So remember, this would be like looking at kind of the MARC view of the record. A couple of things you'll notice here, and we're going to look more at records, and we're going to look at sort of what the interface will look like that's not the code view. But you see here this BF, that is the prefix, and that's going to tell you you're looking at a BIBFRAME record. So this is a BIBFRAME record. We've got the BF here for, that's our prefix. And then the other thing you'll notice here, if you've looked at other web development stuff, and some of you may have looked at XML, or maybe you've done a little HTML or something like that, we always have opening and closing tags. So this is a nested hierarchical code view, and it's pretty easy to see the hierarchy here because you can kind of see how it indents, but it is a nested view. So we have BIBFRAME, that's our prefix telling us what we have here. Contribution is the element. So this would be like contributor. And then when we look down here at the bottom, we see BF with that slash. That tells us that is turning off that tag. And you can have multiple tags within here as we do. So what we're looking at really here is we're looking to see how our names are displaying. So BF agent, that starts BIBFRAME, and our element is agent. Remember, agent is authority or person. This case we have a person, a personal name. So BF is our prefix. This is our element right here with the BF and agent. And if you look here, you can see that we have the name. So there's the name for Flanagan Terry. And we actually have the label, so we have both. And then when you look down here, we have the MARC part of it. So we have all three in here. Oh, and we have the linked data up here in the RDF resource. So where it says ontologies, BIBFRAME, person, and then up above it, it has authorities, slash name, and there's that linked data aspect. So in this BIBFRAME example, we actually have all three parts of that. We have the label, Flanagan Terry. We have the MARC information of where it's coming from. There's that label where it says Flanagan Terry. So we have the label, we have the linked data with link to Terry Flanagan's authority record, and we have the URI, that official form of the name. So we actually have all three of those in this record. Not every BIBFRAME record is going to have all three because some people just may not put all of that in. More than likely, the important piece of it will be that link. So we've talked a little bit about the semantic web and the Internet of Things, about data and relationships, preferring to link to data instead of data entry. So that's going to be something that we'll be talking about more in the future as a whole, community of practitioners. But there are other terms that are associated with the semantic web, and we're going to go through them just briefly, just a couple of them, because you'll see these when you're out reading stuff. One is resource description framework, and you may have noticed when we looked at this, I'm going to have to go back. When we looked at this, this RDF here, that's actually the framework that surrounds this, and you can kind of think of it like the code part of it. And then there's OWL, which is an ontology, and this links to, that's sort of like a controlled vocabulary kind of thing. So when you're out in the sort of semantic web stuff, where you start reading BIBFRAME stuff, if you come across these terms, you'll just have a kind of a little cheat sheet in terms of what they mean. We've already talked a lot about URIs, so we're not going to talk about them more. RDF, You may think like, well, why can't we just use MARC and put it in XML or something? Well, we can do that to kind of get it out of MARC. So you can convert MARC to MARC XML, which is a XML format, and then you could use it in other things, but it's still formatted as MARC, which is the problem, right? Because like all those indicators and subfields and things like that, those are just very confusing to a system, and they don't match up practically with any other kind of programming language out there. So the World Wide Web Consortia, now this is the kind of larger group that oversees like all kinds of web stuff. They work very hard on trying to encourage standards. Now, because no one is in charge of the World Wide Web, right? No one's in charge of the internet. There's no way to really impose standards on the web. So it's very much a volunteer effort. Certainly libraries have been doing their best to, we've been working on standards for years and trying to have good practices and all that kind of thing. There are other communities out there trying to do the similar thing. But the World Wide Web looks at various things and tries to come up with some standards that are applicable across various systems. So they kind of look at things as a whole and try to come up with some standards. One of the ones they came up with, which was developed in 1999, so it's been around since the beginning of the web, is RDF. And this is a simple metadata model, and it's based upon those triplets. So it's based upon the building relationships. It reflects the relationships of items. It's meant to be neutral, so it's not dependent on any vendor and it's not dependent on any operating system. It's meant to be neutral. And most importantly, BIBFRAME can be expressed in RDF. So you can create, as we saw in that example, you can create BIBFRAME in RDF. So we looked at some examples already of relationships. University of Georgia, that'd be resource as subject, located in, predicate, Athens, Georgia, object. The Raven is written by Edgar Allan Poe. RDA is typically, in terms of the actual code format, is typically in XML. And XML is extensible markup language. And I'll try to point that out as we're looking at records. So let's dig into BIBFRAME. I feel like I've hopefully given you a good foundation that you at least understand when you encounter some of these terms, sort of how they fit into what we do and how we're looking to be part of that larger community. So the most important part about BIBFRAME is it goes beyond MARC. It applies modern data practices to bibliographic data. It can be created in different frameworks. You can actually make a BIBFRAME MARC record, and we'll look at one in just a second. You can use XML, you can use RDF, there's something called Turtle that you can use, and we're going to look at that too. BIBFRAME focuses on the data, structure, and the relationships, and that is implementing everything that is kind of coming out of our framework. So Ferber, and when we get to authority data, that part of it. So RDA is the guidelines for what we put into our records. BIBFRAME would be how we format those records. So in some ways, what we've been doing is we use RDA and then we use the MARC record to format it, and we don't really have to go beyond that. I mean, we're sort of looking at the code view, except usually what most of us are looking at, like when we look at an OCLC record or we look at a record in our catalog, we're not actually looking at the raw MARC code view either. We're looking at a sort of a display that's prettied up. I know it's hard to believe it's prettied up, but it is. So we're actually looking at something kind of in between the code and what would be displayed on the front of the ILS. But so we really are focused on the guidelines for descriptive content, and then we have to figure out like what those MARC indicators and fields should be. BIBFRAME will be similar to that, and we're going to look at actually how to create a BIBFRAME record in just a second, but BIBFRAME will be similar to that. So what we're looking at right now in terms of the code is just so that when you're seeing this, when you go look at it, you'll have a sense of kind of how it works. But I'm not anticipating that anybody's going to be writing code, as I've said, unless you need to interact with the code for a specific reason. Maybe you're migrating records, maybe you're trying to convert MARC records into BibFrame to see how it works. Maybe you just want to compare MARC records and BibFrame records, that kind of thing. BibFrame also breaks data into smaller bits, and it's going to move. There's been some really amazing kind of early work looking at how BibFrame could really break our data into smaller bits. And to move from a flat record, because when we look at a MARC record, it's kind of top to bottom, right? You might have a holding record that hangs off of it, or you might have an item record that hangs off of it. But the data is in one record, kind of top to bottom. And BibFrame is really looking at how we can start looking at decentralizing that data a little bit. That's going to be even further down the road, my feeling is. I think we're going to focus more on building relationships and getting our records out of MARC into this BibFrame, and then we'll look at how we can decentralize data more. So this is directly from the BibFrame FAQs, and I think it's really good. If you've not read the FAQs or not seen the FAQs, I think it's worth going to look at. I've given you the link there. BibFrame, instead of bundling everything neatly as a record and potentially duplicating information across multiple records, the BibFrame model relies heavily on resources between relationships. And we're going to look at that in just a minute, because it actually looks at the WIMI model and breaks it down and makes it a little bit easier. It manages this by using controlled identifiers. That's where we get to our URIs. So controlled identifiers, it's using those URIs, Uniform Resource Identifier. And the most important part of that is it kind of looks at what we've already been doing. Like, we use language codes in our records. Sometimes we use geographic codes. But BibFrame is seeking to make that the norm, so that when there's the chance or the opportunity to put a URI in or a URL, so we can link. So when there is the opportunity to put that link in for a name, that we would choose to do so. So it's looking to make that the norm instead of the exception. And probably, as we've talked about it, it's really looking at how we can become part of a much larger web of data where things are paramount between all of these different things, and the relationships are so important. I pulled this directly out of the BibFrame conventions. We're not going to go through all of them, but I do think they're worth reading through. We've already talked about the data type and the object property with that prefix, for example, BF version, so we've already talked about that. There's our URIs and labels. We already talked about that. When referencing a resource, provide the URI, and that can be a link, and BibFrame would encourage it to be a link. A label, so that would be like the authorized form of the name, or both. If you don't have anything to put into that field, or you do not want to put link data into your records, BibFrame takes no position on that. So that's all that means. Like, we're not going to tell you you have to do this, but we're going to tell you we prefer for you to do that. I think number 3 could have been written much simpler because all it's saying is that we recognize that URIs are linked data friendly. Not having anything's not, but you can do either one. Reciprocal properties, if there is a relationship between the properties, this would be our elements. If there's a relationship between them, make that relationship if appropriate. Few other things, we already talked about RDF and being able to see that. They have defined, this is the BibFrame terminology, class names are nouns and property names suggest verbs, so they're just telling you their definitions for those things. But it is a little bit, when you start reading like the BibFrame conventions, it does get a little bit wordy, and you have to kind of deconstruct it a little bit and just kind of think through what are they actually talking about. But the most important one of all that for me is that URI aspect. So what does BibFrame actually look like, and how do we create it? So this is an example of a BibFrame project, and Romeo and Juliet's such an easy one because of course there's like 15 gazillion different printings of Romeo and Juliet, and they have different names. So we in our MARC records would usually put a uniform title in for Romeo and Juliet so that we could get to, our patrons get to all the Romeo and Juliets. But then in our 245 or our title field, we would actually record, as over here under publications, we would actually record the name Romeo and Julieta, the La Tragedia de Romeo y Julieta, or Romeo and Juliet. So we'd record the titles that appears on the piece. BIBFRAME would call these instances, and we're going to look at how these map between Ferber and BIBFRAME. Agent, you know, here's William Shakespeare here. I think that's an easy one to kind of figure out. So this is sort of, when you look at it, you may think, well, it doesn't really look that different. I mean, kind of the presentation's kind of different, but, you know, that's kind of like when you look in an ILS and you kind of see that uniform title and then you see all the other, you know, all the other works. And so what our patrons are going to see is probably not all that different from what we would see. I've just kind of given you the labels in terms of how that would be. Another project that's a fun one to go poke around in if you've not taken a look at it is OCLC's Fiction Finder, and they do the same thing about that. Do the same thing where you have a what I would call, you could even call the master record in terms of the work, the WIMI model. You could even think of that as the master record to pull all those editions together, and they do such a nice job where they actually tell you how many editions in how many language and how many libraries own it. But again, this is that notion of a master record to pull all of those various editions together, and that's the work level record in both WIMI, in that Ferber model, and in the BIBFRAME model. So I talked a little bit, tiny bit, we hadn't talked too much about the WIMI model, but the WIMI model, and I did mention this earlier, this is really looking at, when first started looking at how we were going to kind of think about our data in a different way, decision was made by a committee that we would break our this is just our bibliographic data until we get down to the item aspect of it, but we're just going to break our bibliographic data down. So the work would be kind of that master record approach like we saw with Don Quixote. You know, here's the record that kind of talks about everything, and it includes the things that are in common across all of those. So that's at the work level, and then the expression is this weird bucket where we have the act of creating something, the act of performing something, the act of writing something. So additions can sometimes go in here. It depends kind of on how you're defining that. But for those of us who are kind of cataloging, daily cataloging kind of stuff, work and expression are abstract concepts. As we can see here when we have kind of this master record approach, there's no one book that covers, you know, there's no one book that's 111,952 editions. This is a record that's kind of a composite that's pulling out the things that are in common and then telling how many editions there are across that landscape. So the work level is kind of that master composite record that pulls together the information that's more about it as a whole. Now, if you've written one fiction book and you've written no other fiction books and there's no other editions of it, no translations, your book didn't sell very well, you probably have a work record that looks very similar. You know, your work and manifestation record are not going to have too much difference. Your manifestation record would be what actually talks about the qualities of that individual printing, though. It would include things like how many pages it is, what size it is, who your publisher is, things like that. So when we are cataloging, sort of day-to-day cataloging, things that come across your desk, the ebook record you need to load, that's that manifestation level record. You know, these terms, I didn't pick them. I'll have to admit, they're not my favorites. The thing is, I can't think of anything better, so that's unfortunate. But manifestation is that physical item or that digital object that comes across your desk that you're going to catalog. The work level is that sort of master record, what qualities are the same for all of those versions. The subjects, the author, a few more things than that. The the expression was that weird, I mean, it is a weird kind of, it's the act of doing something before it's actually been completed. So it's sort of a weird area. The item is the place you put a barcode on. Or is that individual, if you have digital copies, it might be that individual digital copy with its unique ID. So it's that individual thing that you have on your shelves the most likely to be. So that'd be like a copy record, or it might be like a barcode record, or it could be just called an item record. So that one's pretty easy for us to see. That's that barcode record we're going to create when we put the barcode in the book. Manifestation, that's going to be our bibliographic record in most systems. That's the OCLC records. And work, we really don't deal with work records much, but whoever creates that uniform title record, they are creating a work record, because that uniform title is that record that's going to pull all the information that's going to be consistent across the editions. So I think one of the things that BIBFRAME does that's fantastic is they kind of eliminate that expression, that E, because it's such a weird area, and it's like when you would create an expression record, for one thing, for most of us, like if you're an OCLC, there's not really a way to create all of these records. And the idea is that the data would inherit down. So one day, for those of you who are copy cataloging, one day, if someone is created, if we have this kind of hierarchy, when you go to copy catalog, you would know that the subjects for your copy of Romeo and Juliet would include the subjects that all copies of Romeo and Juliet have. So it's not up to the individual cataloger anymore. The subject headings would be at the work level, and they're going to inherit down. So you don't need to worry that your subject headings are going to be different from other areas, other copies of Romeo and Juliet, other versions of Romeo and Juliet. The same thing with the authority record. The name, William Shakespeare's name, in that 100 field, that information would inherit down to you. So you wouldn't have to worry about ever worrying that your name was incorrect. Now remember when we talked about linked data, like you wouldn't have to change the information in the records? Well, that information would then be at the work level, so there'd be even less work in terms of maintenance. So, WMI, if we ever can truly get to WMI, which maybe we're just going to skip it, but if we could ever truly get to WMI, that would definitely save some work on the copy cataloging side of it, because your authorities would be good. You wouldn't have to worry about it. You wouldn't have to check it, nothing. You just know because it's coming from the work record. And really, that's going to simplify what you're checking. You're going to still have to check title, obviously. You're still going to have to check your pages and things like that, but you're going to know that the other parts of the information are good. That also is going to make it easier for people who don't have access to the authority files, or maybe don't understand how to read the authority files. They're not going to have to worry about that at all. So BIBFRAME says, well, what about that WMI thing? And what are we going to do with it? And I am not privy to any of the decisions, so I have no idea why decisions were made in the way they were. So you'll have to talk to someone on the committees for that. They said, okay, work and expression, we're just going to collapse it into one bucket called work. Yay, I think that's fantastic. Manifestation, we're going to call instance. And then item, we're going to call, well, item. Again, information's going to inherit down, but we've just collapsed the WE into work. So again, if you are copy cataloging, or in the future, if you're copy cataloging on BIBFRAME records, or if you were creating a BIBFRAME record, then you might need to create a work record at that higher level and then that instant record. So for copy catalogers, we would be at the instance level in BIBFRAME. We don't really have the ability to copy catalog in BIBFRAME right now, but I'll talk a little bit about how that part of it works. So we've already talked about the work, instance, and item. So, we talked about that sort of master record that pulls together all of the qualities that would be across the versions. So like subjects, authorship, that authorities. We talked a little bit about the instance and the item, so that hopefully will make a little bit of sense. Then we have three other concepts that you'll see in BIBFRAME, and we've already touched on these, and these are in that new version of our foundations. So this is in that library reference model. Agents, I already mentioned agents. I just like to think of like super secret agent. That just helps me remember it. Like you know, all the authors are kind of sleuthing around in their secret agent hats. Whatever helps you understand it and remember it. So agent are the people, organizations, jurisdictions, etc. associated with a work, because remember that authority aspect for the names would be at the work level, and then their roles associated with it. Now, I will say, because we are cataloging at the manifestation level, you may think, well, gosh, the subject headings are in a MARC record or in a BIB record or in a OCLC record. What in the world is she talking about? It has subject headings in it. Well, because we don't really have the ability to create all of these separate records that are connected together in a hierarchy in OCLC. You know, if you go in OCLC, you see one record, and it either matches your thing or it doesn't, right? I mean, that's kind of the simplest part of it. We don't really have this multi-level hierarchy. You don't go up and look through and find a work record and then find an expression level and find a manifestation, and it's like, oh, there's my record that matches my thing on my desk. We don't have that. So when you look at a record in OCLC, the subject headings, they would be in a work record if we had such a thing. But because we do not have systems, and your ILS probably doesn't do this yet either, because we don't have systems that allow us to create this hierarchy of data for our bibliographic information, it just all gets stuck into manifestation. So the manifestation record is a collapsed version of the W, E, and M. So hopefully that helps make sense of like, why I know there's subject headings in that record. So agents, we already talked about. Subjects, we already talked about. I think we all know subjects. Events is a new one, and this has to do with time and, you know, events. So BIBFRAME, here we see our prefix label. Again, we're looking at code views. Prefix label, elements are different than MARC but similar. And we do see our URIs as URLs kind of sprinkled throughout. Again, you can see that prefix label right there that says BF. That means you're looking at a BIBFRAME record. This one happens to be coded as RDF and XML. You can see that, well, I know it's XML because I recognize the structure. If I had the whole record, which this is just a snippet, if I had the whole record, I would see it said XML up at the top. And if I kind of wander around in this record, I'll see that it also has RDF listed there. So MARC versus BIBFRAME, and you remember I said there was something called Turtle. Turtle's over here on the right, and this is just another way that we can create BIBFRAME. So that's one of the things that as our systems develop, they will need to figure out what BIBFRAME format they're going to use on the back end. Now, if you're cataloging in your ILS and they've moved on to BIBFRAME in the back end, you may not see any of this BIBFRAME stuff. You may just be looking at a work form, and we're going to look at an example of that and talk about it in just a second. I happen to know that ALMA allows you to see BIBFRAME, but you're looking at more of a MARC record when you're cataloging. But again, you see the BF for your prefix, that tells you that it is BIBFRAME. What you may see here when you look at this, you'll notice that it's a little bit more, it's structured a little bit different than, say, this very code view. So code view, when you're looking at an XML, you're going to have these triangles, those little angle brackets, and we talked about the nested hierarchy and it turns off and on. You'll also see the RDF there if you're looking at RDF. And if you're looking at Turtle, you're going to see RDF sometimes, but you're not going to see those angled brackets. So those angled brackets are going to tell you that you're looking at an XML version of this. So in WMI, if you create an original record for a book in OCLC are you creating it at the work level or just the manifestation? You are creating it just at the manifestation level unless you are creating a uniform title record. So for most of us, when we are cataloging originally in OCLC, we are just creating a manifestation title. That's the other thing too, our rules for when we would create these records, because we don't have catalogs and OCLC really can't do this. So that's one of the other things that happened here that's kind of impacted us, I think, is that this group got together and they came up with this great idea about how we're going to break up data and the data will inherit down, and that's going to be fantastic and it's going to be helpful and it's going to make our records more accurate and it's just going to be fantastic. And guess what? We had no system that could do it, right? So we came up with this great idea as a community to break our data up, and we looked at how our data should be modeled in these other systems, but our systems can't really do it yet because they're so tied to MARC, you know? So because we're tied to MARC, and MARC's a single file kind of thing, OCLC's tied to MARC, that's a single file thing, and that has limited our ability to embrace this. But as we start looking at BIBFRAME, we're looking at getting out of MARC completely, and at that point we would be able to do things together. So having talked to quite a few ILS vendors over the last few years, especially when I go to ALA, they are working on things and they are looking at BIBFRAME and starting to work on things, but they are very much challenged with how to support MARC and how to start supporting implementing BIBFRAME at the same time. So it is a huge challenge for them to be able to simultaneously handle two different complete data formats, two different complete programming languages, and be able to get them to work together so when people are searching, it's seamless, or to figure out a way to convert everything in a database from one thing to another. And then if we do that, when is the turn stop and when do you start with the next? So, you know, there's a lot going on with BIBFRAME besides just sort of, you know, what we're looking at here. And we're going to talk just a little bit more about it. So we've looked at some examples, looked at more examples. It goes on and on and on. You will notice that the records are much bigger. They're going to be a lot larger. Our system, newer systems, should be able to handle that, and I called this part 1 because it really just goes on and on and on. In the resources, there are lists to implement. There's a link to a page that has nothing but implementations listed on it, and it'll tell you a little bit about each implementation for BIBFRAME. So my suggestion would be to go through and actually look at these and do some MARC BIBFRAME comparisons. Spend some time actually looking at this, because once you look at it, it's going to, I think it's going to feel a little bit better. Turtle is easier to read. I think we could see that just right there. It's much easier to read. There's still the BF that's kind of weird looking, and you know, the terminology is a little bit different, but it's easier to pick out things, I think. Turtle is easier to read, more text oriented. RDF XML will have that element, those angle brackets, and it's going to then turn off that element. So it's going to be slash with those little side triangles. Basically, Turtle explains everything in a specific format. If you're like, well, where did Turtle come from? What is Turtle? Turtle stands for Terse RDA Triple Language. Triple? What about triple? Getting to that relationship aspect. So if you go through a Turtle record and you actually look at it, you will see things like instance of to explain that relationship. BF has relationship of. So Turtle actually explains out the relationships quite extensively, in my opinion. So we've looked at a lot of code here. We're gonna walk away from the code. You're likely not going to need to code records in BIBFRAME, but understanding the structure can be helpful, and comparing MARC and BIBFRAME records together, I think can make it feel a little bit better. BIBFRAME can incorporate MARC in or any other schema. We've already talked about how we can use it for other things. We do have options, and so this is going to be sort of the next big step, I think, is how ILS vendors and OCLC, who is working on projects, testing things, how it's going to work for us. You know, whether are they going to convert records or not? Are they going to use MARC XML in the middle? What are they going to do? How are we going to do this? So that's the big piece of it. Just remember that when you originally catalog or create metadata, how you record the titles, the details, all that kind of stuff, that's the guidelines from RDA. Which controlled vocabulary thesaurus you use, that's either RDA or your library's choice. So RDA impacts the cataloging of the work itself. BIBFRAME impacts the mechanics of that work. So it's going to impact that kind of stuff. So I mentioned the register already. This is a fantastic resource. I cannot stress it again. If you know what your ILS is, if you have a more modern ILS, I would say, like Alma has a whole section on linked data, and you can actually go see what they're doing in terms of linked data, and they have all of the records in Alma can be viewed or exported as BIBFRAME. So they are already doing a lot of work, and you can actually, depend on how your system's set up and depend upon your access level, you can see BIBFRAME records and MARC records at the same time. So there are ILSs that are starting to work on this, but there's also some other projects here to look at. There's one that's the BIBFRAME search interface. That's the University of Illinois. If you go there, that's more of a public interface, and you can kind of see it from the public side too. We've been very much looking at the back-end code view of things. So compare MARC, BIBFRAME and MARC records together. The Library of Congress has a really nice resource to that. You will need the LCCN, so that is in the 010 field of a record, and I would suggest looking for something sort of recent, maybe within the last 5 or 6 years. Easiest way is probably to find something in OCLC or your ILS and then jot down the 010, but you can certainly take my number here because that is in there and take a look at it. They have not converted all MARC records in the LC catalog to BIBFRAME in this service to where you can see both. So you will need an LCCN, and not everything's going to be in there. It's sort of a sample so that you can look at. But this is very useful to kind of go through and look at it and see what it's going to look like. And you can see it in XML, or you can see it in a more text view and take a look at it. You can also use MARCEdit to convert records into BIBFRAME. This is a lot of fun. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I will say it can be a little bit quirky. It's in the MARC Next. So if you are a MARCEdit user, MARCEdit is a free software to use. You can do all kinds of amazing things with MARCEdit. You can retrospectively enhance your library catalog records to make them more RDA-esque. You can check your authorities against the National Authority File. Alas, it will not fix your authorities if it finds something wrong, but it will tell you which ones you need to fix. So there's so much you can do in MARCEdit, and then in the MARC Next is all of the amazing things you can do, sort of new fun stuff. So MARCEdit is free to use. It is from Terry Reese. I believe he's at Oregon. He's one of us. So this is developed by one of us for us. So it's awesome. He teaches workshops and does all kinds of things for MARCEdit. I also teach workshops for MARCEdit too, but MARCEdit is a great resource. There's that BIBFRAME test bed where you can do some work there. If you really want to start getting into the semantic web fun stuff, Sparkle is just a query language. That's how you can kind of build searches and more semantic web oriented stuff. You can really get way out into the semantic web with this stuff. So if you're interested in this, MARCEdit can be a fun thing to play with BIBFRAME and to look at some linked data kind of stuff. You can also use OpenRefine, which is another free software out there that's from Google, and it's almost like a giant Excel spreadsheet, but it can do a lot of advanced data cleanup, both with MARC records and with non-MARC records. So you just got to convert your MARC records first. So BIBFRAME test. The one thing I just will note to remind you, if you're using if you're using MARCEdit and you haven't done it before, is you have to create a blank file first. So if you've tried using MARCEdit before and you're like, gosh, it just doesn't work, I can't figure it out, go to any notepad or text editor and just create a blank file, and you'll make sure to save it, change your file name to match what you need it to be. So if it's going to be a MARC file, that'd be MRC. If it's going to be an XML, that'd be, of course, XML at the end of it. Once you create that file, then you should be able to run whatever you're doing and it will save it to that file. But for some reason, MARCedit, that's always confused me too, is that you have to have a file there for it to save into, and you've got to be able to tell it what that file is. It will not create a new file. If you leave that blank, it's not going to create a new file for you. It's just going to give you an error message. So that can be a fun thing to do. There's also the BIBFRAME editor, and this is really what I want to talk about for the next little bit here. This is where you can create records. You can use it online, but it's limited online. It's mostly meant to be a demonstration site for viewing the editor. You can save. If you do something online, you can save it, but it's temporary, and I can't figure out what that time period is. It's probably there somewhere, but I have not determined how long it will keep your stuff. You can also download it, which is what I've done, and you have more, but you do have more templates by format online. So it's a little bit kind of like which is better to use. If you're really thinking that you want to play with BIBFRAME records and you really want to use, kind of download something and really just go to town and do maybe like a little test project and just create some records, I would actually probably suggest that you look at either downloading the BIBFRAME from BIBFRAME.org or Scribe, and we're going to talk about the difference between the two in just a minute. So there are now two editors out there you can use. BIBFRAME.org is pop-up oriented, but it follows the MARC order of a record. It can be a little challenging to run locally because you have to actually go into your folder once you download it and open it in a browser. So once you figure that part of it out, it's easy to use. It's just that initial kind of like, well, how do I start it? Because it doesn't have a executionable file. So that's the other thing too, for those of you who may want to put it on a library machine or something else, you may be able to download. If you can download and install something, you should be able to use it because it's not going to actually have an executionable file. Subjects exist at the work level, as we talked about earlier, so you will need to create a work and instant record to have all of the bibliographic fields you're going to need. So remember, if you're using one of these BIBFRAME editors, and we're going to look at two of them, if you're using BIBFRAME.org, it's going to follow the work and instance model, that WI and then item, but really the work and instance, the most important part we want to play with. So your subjects will be in that work area. It will look up, so it will go out and look up against the National Authority file for names and for subjects. So it's going to go out and look for the Library of Congress subject heading file. So it will look up against those, which is really cool. And it does use the RDA vocabulary, so it's going to use RDA terminology. So this one will feel the most like, BIBFRAME.org will feel the most like what I think we would be using. Zephyra, which is one of the people who worked on BIBFRAME early on, they have their own editor. You can use it online or download it. The interface is a little bit clunky, but once it loads, it is very MARC formatted oriented. Again, it looks up against names and subjects. It does not use the RDA vocabularies, which can be a challenge, especially if you're trying to then convert things to MARC records. So I'll talk about that when we look at that interface. The thing that is both good and bad is it looks like one seamless record. So they put work and instance together, as we do in OCLC and as we do as most ILSs. Titles required in both, regardless if you use BIBFRAME.org or Scribe. The exported records are not as robust as what you see in BIBFRAME.org. So it's one of those things where neither one of these is perfect yet, but they're the best interfaces we have right now to kind of see how records would work. So let's look at the BIBFRAME editor. This is from BIBFRAME.org. Create your reference, your resource. Now once you get your resource, you're going to have to choose, I just chose book, then you're going to choose if you're doing a work or if you're doing a work title variation. If you do work title first, then you get your subjects and all of that stuff that you would do in a work record. And then you can do your instance when you're done with that. So This is a work record, so this would be that upper level. And you see up here at the top it says instance of BIBFRAME work, and then we can choose title, and then we choose title. It actually takes us out to another screen, but you have all these little pop-up things that will come up where there's a tab. You can add fields, so like for a series statement, if you just plus, it's going to add another field. The other thing that you need to do is once you put some information in, you have to actually check set next to it to get it to save. So it's almost like you have to save every field as you go. Now you remember when I said that it uses the RDA vocabularies. If you look down here, so I chose book, and it comes up as a default unmediated. So that is the vocabulary for a print physical item. So that, media type comes up because I chose book, but I could easily change that to electronic if it was an electronic book. I've already filled this one in though. So, I chose unmediated because I have a print book. I put in the 225 pages, illustrations, 24 centimeters. So, that's what that information looks like. And I put in dimensions 225 centimeters plus illustrations plus 24 centimeters. And that's how that information got in there. So this is more like what we would expect to see in our future interfaces, I think. The ability to do a work record, and then when you're done with the work record, you see up there, this is my work record. This is just part of it, so subjects and stuff are further down than that. But this is my work record, and then I clicked on instance title because I'm going to actually do my information then. So turtle. Again, just to, looking at what this record looks like, there's our label for unmediated. So, and this is looking at an XML view. So, this is what scribe looks like. Again, this is a one record, so it's combining work and an instance and one interface. And to me, what is a little bit clunky about this is if you kind of get this click on an instance on the left, you get this big box in the middle that kind of tells you what to do, but it's kind of like wasted space, right? And then over here on the left are all these little tiny categories, and you have to click on one of those to get started. So that to me feels a little bit more clunky than this big button that says create a resource. Create a resource, and then you choose your format, and you can go further down. I mean, there's serials and everything else. I was just looking at the monographs kind of stuff. So it feels a little bit clunky to me that your things that you're going to create are kind of over here on the side, and then you have this big box in the middle, which is where your record will be once you get started. But it's sort of, to me, seems wasted space. The other thing here is you have your external resources, so that's what it's going to check against. So it's going to check against the LC subject headings, it's going to check against the LC authorities, it's going to check against the virtual internet file, and you can turn those off. So if you don't want to use those medical subject headings, you don't want it to check those, or you don't want it to check FAST, which are the abbreviated Library of Congress subject headings, you can actually unclick those and it won't bother with those. So that's nice that you can customize it in a little bit of a way in terms of what you're checking, but at the same time, to me, it just feels like just going to the screen, you have to read what it says and then go look for something. Whereas I feel like when you're looking at BIBFRAME.org editor, it's a little bit easier to find it. Now, when you get here, once you start, this to me feels almost MARC record oriented, right? And there's that set. So at the end of each field, you have to click set to save it. So that sometimes works a little bit different from BIBFRAME.org, where BIBFRAME.org seems to accept most things and will kind of move you on, so it'll automatically kind of save when you return for some fields, it seems, whereas Scribe, you actually have to click set for each field. So I'm hoping that this functionality part of it will get a little easier and you won't have to actually go set for each thing that you're doing, because that adds kind of an extra step to cataloging, right? You type in the title and then you have to hit set and then you go on. Whereas, if you could just hit return and go to the next field and then save the record all at one time, that would make more sense, or maybe save automatically along the way or something. But anyway, like I said, they each have their pros and cons, and they each have some, I think it's worth kind of taking a look at both and kind of seeing how they work. And then, if there is discussion in your particular ILS, or if you're in an open source community, you at that point, having looked at both of these, can really provide some feedback about what would work for you and how would you see, what recommendations could you make, or if your ILS has a community group or some kind of committee that's looking at what the BIBFRAME interface would look like for your ILS, then after you play with some of these, hey, maybe volunteer and be part of making it better for all of us. So nice thing, both of them do lookups. I really like the way Scribe does the lookup. I think it's really nice because it's really easy to see what they're looking up against. But this feels very kind of MARC oriented, but without the tags, right? We got our title, 245, we got our title remainder, that'd be our subfield B. We have our alternate titles, we have date, it's very, to me, feels very logical in terms of the presentation. So I really like the way Scribe presents it. It does make it easier, that's combining work and instance into one field, but it does not use the RDA vocabularies, and that's really the biggest deficit for me, is that Scribe is kind of meant for anybody to be able to use, but it doesn't use those RDA vocabularies. Now you can add them and it will add it down here. So for example, when I chose book, it just chose text as the content type, and I want it to be unmediated because it's going to be RDA. I'm doing an RDA BibFrame record. So BibFrame.org is coming out of the library community, and Zephyr did have a hand in kind of getting it started and things like that, but it's very much for us as librarians, as catalogers, whereas Scribe's meant to be a little bit more general and that other people could use it as well if they're using BibFrame. It does look up against a controlled vocabulary, which is really nice, and I love this presentation that Scribe uses in terms of adding the subdivisions. I think that's very easy to understand. So this would be more if you're original cataloging. So what would you do if you're copy cataloging? Well, in BibFrame, there's actually, in both of them, you can actually go in and search in BibFrame, and then you can clone something if you want to work on it. So you can do that. So that's one thing you can do. And then certainly in the BibFrame editor for Scribe, there is the ability to search for existing material. So, how would we do this if we were copy cataloging? Well, if we were copy cataloging, in theory, we would have some OCLC thing that would maybe look sort of like this or not. I don't know what they're working on, but it would allow us to search, find the existing material, we would download the records, but rather than seeing a bunch of code jargon, hopefully, I'm hoping we don't see code jargon, we would see something that would look more like this. So I think in terms of presentation of information, being able to find things, what we're going to see in the future is going to feel much less code oriented. So I'm very hopeful. I love digging around in the code, but at the same time, I think the presentation of information is important, and it can make it really easy to figure out. You can add local vocabularies. So for example, I was trying to use, put in language, and it wasn't able to read English as I was trying to input it in. So you can add local vocabularies, but then if you are going to want to make this into an RDA record and you want it to be in a BibFrame RDA record, it's hard to see there, but it's going to add it as a local field. So it's going to, even if you're using a vocabulary that is an authorized vocabulary, like if I were going to use the MARC language code and I was going to use ENG, it's going to just code it as local in Scribe, and then I would have to convert, I'd have to do some editing on my side to fix that. Really easy to export or save, which is great. So you can export BibFrame and RDF and XML, as we've kind of seen. Like I said, I don't see that we're going to be looking at the code so much. You would just save your record, export your record if you were in some kind of OCLC kind of format like this, and then you might import it right into your institutional repository or ILS if it could support that. You can see here some of the people that they've been working with. So Scribe's been working with UC Davis, NLM, and also working some with government agencies. So there's a spot for those call numbers in there. So I want to talk a little bit as we wrap up here about BIBFRAME projects, and then I want to talk a little bit about kind of what practical steps are for what you can do. So as a point of excitement, yay, the LC MARC catalog in its entirety at the time in May 2017 was converted to BIBFRAME. You may go like, what? Like, where are those records then? Well, they've been working away on them. So 17 plus million MARC records converted to BIBFRAME works instances and items. So Chris, you were talking about an original record and when you're cataloging an OCLC, if you're creating a work or manifestation record, since we don't have the ability to create sort of these generic work records just for every single thing we're created, and we're really just, the only time we would even possibly create a work record is when we're creating that collective title or uniform title like Romeo and Juliet, Don Quixote, for all of the instances of that. That's one thing that OCLC would need to figure out is like, how do we break that data out? How do we take an existing record, which is a combination of a work, expression, manifestation? How do we take that and turn it into, you know, work and instance, say? So that's something that they had to really figure out. Current status, this is actually a current status count probably as of last year that I looked it up, but about 19 million works, 24 million instances, 22.6 million items, and 4.3 billion triples. So those are those relationships. There is also a parallel cataloging project going on at OCLC where catalogers first started out. They had just some catalogers who were cataloging in BIBFRAME. So they first started that out. When BIBFRAME 2 came out, so we've been through BIBFRAME 1, which they kind of worked through some of the kinks and kind of sorted out how it needed to go forward. Much more focus, strong focus on linked data and URI, so that was much more prevalent in this current version of BIBFRAME, which is BIBFRAME 2. So that's LC started a project around 2017. It continues on. And this phase 2, they took everything that they had done initially and they added people to it. And what they are doing is that they are now testing in BIBFRAME with additional testing of the input of non-Latin scripts when there's no corresponding romanization. So they are really starting to test languages and how that would work in BIBFRAME. They're also testing authority description for agents. So how would we do authorities in BIBFRAME? And what would the public end of it look like? They're really starting to look at that, and they've converted their entire bibliographic frame file. So all of the records they have in their Library of Congress ILS have been converted to BIBFRAME as well. So I was able to snag a couple of screens so you could just see what their editor looks like. So again, this is looking at sort of the search or the front end. You can see there it links, they have the ability to link out to the Library of Congress Linked Data Service. So the Library of Congress publishes all the subject headings and all the names as linked data. So those, as we were looking at those links, that's where those links came from. We're looking at those links in the records. So here we're able to see the type of record, an instance or work record, and what kind of resource it is, what its ID number is, who its author is. There's Terry Flanagan again. That Snoopy on wheels. It just keeps showing up all the time. But anyway, we're able to see that information. We're able to search by it, and you can just see the interface is a little bit different. So this is kind of looking at everyone in LC, just the snapshot because it's just the top part of it, but what the new records they've worked on. There's the ability to create a new record and load an existing record. So in terms of looking at a record, this doesn't look different from what we see in our ILSs, right? And I would encourage you to go in and look at some of those implementations of BibFrame that have the public interfaces and take a look, because you'll look at it and you'll see that, well, gosh, it doesn't look all that different from what we currently see. So for us, it's going to be about breaking out the code a little bit. It's also going to be about, for us, it's going to be maybe not seeing, we would not see MARC tags. And I've actually seen some ILS prototypes that will be coming out in the next year or so, probably, that are going to start removing the MARC tags to kind of prepare us mentally to move to a new interface. Now, there'll still be MARC records, and you can look at the MARC view and you can turn the MARC view on so you can see those MARC tags, but there are ILSs that are starting to develop for us interfaces that look more like this, but they're still MARC oriented to kind of help us prepare mentally for not seeing tags. So, I think in the past you've needed to really understand all the MARC tags and the code and what the indicators are and what the subfields are, and then you get that fixed field stuff you have to look at. We are going to eventually strip all that MARC coding stuff that we had to learn. We're just at some point going to be able to move on. And we will be more focused on the description of it, and then if we can build relationships, or maybe we're going to be linking out to data. So you remember when we're linking out to data, here's an example. If we link out to cosmology, then the system can create that linked data on the back end. We're just choosing off of that list. So, our systems in the future should help us and not work against us. And that is really where I think that BibFrame can help us. Once we get out of MARC and the developers can build something that's more modern, we will have more modern capabilities, like being able to look up our authorities and be able to look up our subjects, and to have interfaces that are more logical in terms of how they work. So check out the BibFrame website if you've not done it. Make sure if you are looking at things that are BibFrame related, make sure that you're either on the BibFrame website itself, or if you're looking at resources that it says to. If you see things that say BibFrame 1, I would just skip right over that. There are a few resources, and I've actually pulled a few things in here. There are a few resources that are BibFrame 1 that are great overviews of BibFrame. So, don't eliminate those from your choices completely, but just know that there has been some updates and changes with 2. That MARC to BibFrame comparison viewer, it can be a little challenging because you have to find an LCCN, so you have to find the Library of Congress number that you have the number for it and it's in the comparison tool. You've got one in my examples there, you can pull that one up. But if you look in OCLC or you look in your ILS and find something, maybe for the last few years, or look up Snoopy on Wheels, because that's in there, then if you do that and you get the LCCN for Snoopy on Wheels from OCLC or WorldCat, wherever you're going to get your number from, you just need the LCCN. That's the only thing it can really hook onto. So once you get that number, then you can look up and compare those MARC records and the BibFrame records, and you'll kind of get more of a sense of like what the records look like. And you can take a look at that. The other thing to look at then is, to kind of take a look at the editors. So a few slides back, you mentioned that subjects are at the work levels. I thought subjects were group entities and subjects are what was called group 3 entities, and group 3 is that free SAD or functional requirements of subject authority data. But in terms of where they fit into a record, they fit into a work level record. So they would be recorded at the level of work because the subjects, for example, Romeo and Juliet, the subjects would apply across all the levels of, all the different versions and editions of Romeo and Juliet. It really is going to depend upon how these BibFrame editors are going to sort of, who is going to win the contest of the BibFrame editor? What is it going to look like? And will different ILSs have different things? I think for us, for most of us, it's really going to depend upon what OCLC does. And I know OCLC is working on both linked data projects. They've been talking about linked data projects and how they can link out to authorities, which would be fantastic. But they're also starting to really talk about what they're going to do with BibFrame. So we are at the point right now with BibFrame where I think that there's enough momentum. All of LC has, really converted the record. So once OCLC has converted records, so once they take MARC records and they convert them to BibFrame, that has put some momentum behind these projects, right? So, in order to be able to really develop a good editor, you need something to work with, right? You need some records to code, you need some coded records. You've got to figure out that data structure and what that interface is going to look like. So as they have converted their records in these projects to BibFrame, now we're starting to see like the evolution of the editors. And so that is where I think we are right now. I think we're at the evolution of the editors. I know from talking to ILS vendors, there's quite a few of them that are looking at BibFrame. A lot of them are looking at linked data. Some of them are looking at creating an interface that does not have MARC tags, but is a MARC-based interface still, to kind of get us mentally prepared for not seeing MARC tags, because some of us probably dream MARC in our sleep. So we're going to need to have a little moment when we finally got a MARC, I think. So take some time to play with BibFrame and really take a look at the difference between bibframe.org. Like I said, it's easier to download it and run it on your computer. Starting the BibFrame editor on your computer is a little weird because you actually got to go in the folder and you'll find something that says BibFrame editor or editor, and you'll just click on that file and it'll open. So that's a little bit weird. But once you get in there, then you can kind of play with it, and then you can also take a look at Scribe, which you can do online or download, either one. And use that comparison tool, compare some MARC records in BibFrame, maybe Snoopy on wheels. No judgment here. And then take a look at some of the BibFrame projects that are out there and kind of see what you think about them. And then maybe create some BibFrame records. You've got 2 resources to play with. I hope I've given you enough information about the pros and cons of how they work. And most importantly, just be open-minded and consider how the work of cataloging is shifting. For those of you who are copy cataloging, you're probably not going to be worrying about this too much yet. Once OCLC starts preparing for whatever its new interface is going to be, or your ILS is preparing for its new interface, at that point you're really going to see some changes. I would think the first change you would see the MARC field tags just magically disappear one day. You'll still have the labels, as we saw in the examples, where it'll say title, alternate title, or whatever we're going to call that. But I think you'll still see that information. Your work you're going to be doing is the same. You're still going to be looking at the record. Does the record match? If it doesn't, do I create original record? And then how do I do that? For those of you who are doing original cataloging, I would say go ahead and start kind of experimenting with BibFrame, getting a sense of how it would work, thinking a little bit more about sort of the what do you need it to do? What are the pros and cons of these systems? And then, like I said, as your ILS is starting to do some development or discussion, or if you're part of the open source community, thinking about how you can help guide the building of the interface, because that's the other piece of it too. So, we revised our cataloging rules so that we weren't tied to MARC anymore, but we are still tied to MARC, right? So now our next big step, one small leap for cataloging kind, our next big step is to get us out of MARC. And it may take some time because, like I said, vendors are going to have to figure out how they're going to do it. And some of them are much further along than others. And maybe some vendors aren't going to be able to make the shift at all. Or maybe they'll just convert the records to BibFrame on their side and there will be no there's going to be nothing we do on our side. So on that note, we've had some great questions. Thank you so much. I've put everything into a folder, and there's actually a little quiz there on the folder, and I hope you enjoy playing with BibFrame. I think we're at a very exciting time for cataloging. For those of you who copy catalog, I think the coolest thing about if we actually get to this model of the work and instant record is that you would know that your authorities that were listed on the record were right. And so you wouldn't, I know sometimes working in a large academic library, we'd have like 8 editions of one thing, right? First edition, second edition, third edition revised, whatever. It'd go on to like up to 8. And the subject headings, depend on who cataloged it, they would be different. Now they shouldn't be different. The person who was creating the record, who was doing original cataloging, should have looked to see what the second edition said, or first edition, and there should have been some consistency, but there often wasn't. And that also meant that sometimes the classification wasn't right. The call numbers weren't exactly right, so that the editions would sit next to each other. And so it was one of those things of being in a large academic library. It's like, how much time can you really take to check all the subject headings, to check your authorities, to check the call number? That's a whole lot of time that you could be doing other work. So for those of you who are in libraries where you have just a huge amount of work, or maybe you're small staff, or maybe you're the only, or you just don't have time to do that kind of authority work, if we can get to the point where we get work and instant records and we get authorities as linked data, then we're going to see some of that work ease up. And then for those of you who have been like, well, what am I going to do? There is so much local stuff you can catalog. I bet you have special archives. I bet you have GIFs. You might have a backlog somewhere. Maybe you need to look at your ebooks for once. There is something you can do. So don't ever sell yourself short that if this work happens, you're going to have nothing to do. It's just you're going to need to look to see what you've not been able to do before in the past. And on that note, thank you everyone, and have a great rest of your day.